Welcome to Lantern Voices, a podcast by Lantern Publishing and Media. Welcome back to Lantern Voices, a new podcast by Lantern Publishing and Media. I am Louisa, your host for this episode. I am a part of the team at Lantern doing marketing, PR, and social media. In this podcast, we'll talk with authors that publish books with us here at Lantern. We'll talk about their books, their careers in activism, and everything that they do to make our world a better place. If you're listening to us on the feed, please consider giving us a follow at LanternPM on Instagram. We are so close to reaching 3,000 followers. We really appreciate your help with that. And I promise there will be no boring posts there. If you're interested in veganism, animal rights, and climate activism, which I assume you are because you tune into this podcast, I am sure you will love our page. Now, without further ado, let's welcome today's guest, Hope Bohanec. Hi, Hope. How are you doing today?
I'm great, thanks.
Some people listening probably already know you from your book, The Humane Hoax, or from your podcast, Hope for the Animals. But besides being an author and a podcaster, Hope has been an animal rights activist for over 30 years now. Can you tell us a little bit about your trajectory as an activist and the work that you've been doing?
Sure. So I have always loved animals. When I was a child growing up, I used to have animal pictures all over my walls. And when people would ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would say that I wanted to work with animals. And my mom told me this, and I didn't know what that was going to look like. But I went vegetarian at 16, and that was in the 80s, and then vegan at 20, that was in 1990. And when I went to college, the animals were just calling me. I mean, they were just strongly calling me to take action for them. And I got into radical, nonviolent direct action in the environmental realm in Northern California with Earth First. We were doing tree sits and blockades of logging roads with these devices. And I took some of those tactics back to the Bay Area, where I was living at the time, San Francisco Bay Area. And we would blockade slaughterhouses. And I did direct action work through the 90s in my 20s. And, I really wanted to work for the animals every day, every hour of every day. So my pendulum swung to professional animal advocacy. And I worked doing legislative work and worked with In Defense of Animals for many years. And then I kind of swung back to the middle area, what I consider the middle area of activism with vegan education. And I think that is what I do best. And I worked with United Poultry Concerns for a decade pre-pandemic. And then I started my own organization during the pandemic, Compassionate Living. And as you mentioned, the Hope for the Animals podcast. We have the Ahimsa Living Project and the Humane Hoax Project. And that connects now to the book that I have edited with Lantern, The Humane Hoax. And so that's part of that project this book that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, we're definitely going to go talk about the book. But before we get there, there's some things that you said that I wanted you to go a little bit deeper about, if that's okay. First, you mentioned about your trajectory as an activist during the barricades and all of that in, I think, the 80s, 90s when you were in your 20s. That for me, it sounds like things that I've seen on TV, I've heard about, or I've read in books. So I was very curious when you just said that because I didn't know that about you. How was that? It really sounds like something from a movie for me.
Yeah, it was intense, honestly. And it's interesting because there's direct action happening now on some level, and people think that, it's all so new and it's newly happening for the animals. But really it's not. We were doing some pretty intense, direct, nonviolent, direct action back in that time. And it was challenging because we didn't have social media to tell our own story. We relied on just who happened to be around at the time and local media outlets that were not very friendly to us. So not a lot of people heard our story or heard the animals' stories, unfortunately. But it was really important to us to do that at that time, and I mean, we did some radical things. It was yeah, it was dangerous. It was daring. You had to be incredibly courageous. There was only a handful of us that were willing to do it, and we would get arrested. And I had numerous arrests for trespassing and other other violations back in those days. And it was you had to really be very dedicated to do that work.
I can imagine, especially, I think one of the things that we talk a lot about on social media nowadays, I see the younger activists doing, is saying how much you have to take your activism out of social media because, as important as it is to spread the message, if you're just talking within a bubble or preaching to the choir and things like that, you're not going to go much from what you started. So it's interesting to hear those stories, and especially what was done before social media was an option, and and really get inspired by it because it sounds like actions like that could still perhaps be done. I'm sure there are activists out there that are still doing it. Maybe we just don't hear about them as often as we used to from like what you guys did.
Yeah. Well, I think that, tactics change and evolve over time.
Mhm.
Things that we did were very labor intensive and very at this point now, with all the laws, the ag gag laws and different things like that, they make it very, very difficult to do the things that we did back then. It would be hard, it would be very difficult to do them now. And possibly be facing very long prison sentences and things like that. So it's a completely different kind of atmosphere now with direct action. But people are still doing it in different ways, I think. So, but yeah, it's interesting history. I wish somebody would write about that history because people don't know what we did back then.
Yeah, I mean, I have this memory, in still when I was living in Brazil, I was starting to go vegetarian. I was 12 probably, and I remember reading in a magazine about it. And it was a whole feature story about animal rights activism. And it was a regular magazine. It wasn't like a niche magazine. So I remember discussing back and forth with my mom about it, and she was telling me the stories that she used to listen when she was a teenager. She was a vegetarian for a while when she was a teenager, and she was telling me about that too. So it's very nice to hear about that firsthand account that you just told me. Thank you very much.
Of of course, and if I can say one more thing about that, we have really moved away though from that kind of in the streets direct
Mhm.
action protest type activism and very much swung to more of the inside game of legislation and working with the industry and changing the conditions, things like that. But
Mhm.
I outside game that in the streets activism is so important, such a critical component to changing hearts and minds, and changing the dynamic of the urgency of the situation. So I want to encourage that kind of innovation of direct action. I think that it's a really important part of our activist profile.
So you were mentioning about your past. If you could tell us a little bit more about how that connects with your project right now. How did you move with the passage of time, with the change of activism in general, your activism? How did that become what you're doing today?
Yeah, well, as I was saying, it's really intense doing that direct action and kind of unsustainable. I felt, for me at least, you just, I ended up spending a lot of time in court and a lot of time on it was intense. We did some great work for the time that we did it, and I just felt like I wanted to move on to other things that I felt would be more effective for me, especially as I learned more. I became more of an educator. I started giving presentations and talking to people and writing articles, and that started to evolve more, and that evolved into what I do now, which is mostly vegan education through my podcast, through webinars, through speaking at different veg fests, all of that. and through writing. And now I've written 2 books on the subject of the humane hoax. So that I feel is the best the best thing that I can do for the animals now.
If you're a human being living in the 21st century, chances are that you check your email every day. Also, chances are that your inbox is constantly pretty full. We know how important it is to keep up to date with things that matter. This is why our newsletter is so amazing. We only send 1 newsletter a month, and within it, you'll find all our latest news and, sometimes, access to exclusive content. Recently, we went through all our contacts and did a huge cleanup, trying our best to make sure that no one is in the list multiple times and no one's going to keep getting tons of emails. We want to keep you informed without overwhelming you with 1,000 messages. We know you don't have time to waste with 100 new emails. Give your time to what really matters. Go to lanternpm.org and sign up for our newsletter today.
And how did the book came to be? The idea came through the project? Was it something that was always on your mind?
Yeah. So when I was with In Defense of Animals, this was in the early 2000s, the work that we had been doing, that vegans and animal activists had been doing, was starting to kind of have an effect. And the media was starting to talk about it a little bit. And you'd hear things about antibiotics and, the animals getting antibiotics, things like that, and environmental impacts. And back then, the only labels, like in the 90s, early 2000s, the only labels that you saw on meat products and animal products were things like young or fresh or farm fresh. And the young one, really, that it's so funny to think back on that because people wanted their animals slaughtered young, like that was a sign of freshness. But now that has shifted so much, that's a sign that, well, we haven't given this animal any kind of a life, right? So they're certainly not using labels like that anymore. And so the labels started shifting, and you started seeing labels like grass fed and humane, things like that. And this is early 2000s, and I thought this would be kind of maybe an interesting area to start researching, to start exploring. I'm interested in the psychology of marketing, why people do what they do. And I started investigating farms, like actually going out to the farms that had these labels on the products that were coming out of these farms. And I thought I'd maybe write some articles about it. And I went into the work. It's kind of interesting because I went into the work thinking that I was going to say things like, well, grass fed is better, but going vegan's best, or free range is better, and these are the conditions, but going vegan is best, right? That's what I thought I was going to be doing, but that is not what I found. I remember there was a free range egg farm where the chickens were outside, but there was like it was kind of like a side yard, like if you can think of someone's side yard, just a chain link fence side yard. And there was about 200 hens in this small area, this small pen that was basically a mud hole. I mean, the birds were covered in mud. They were dirty. There was nowhere for them to get out of the mud. So, yeah, they were outside of the confinement buildings, but they were in horrible conditions. And I remember also going to a certified humane dairy where there was a cow and she had a swollen back leg. Her leg and ankle were swollen about 3 times their normal size, as compared to the other legs. And she was limping terribly. There was also on the same farm, there was a tiny calf who was he was wet, and I don't know if he was wet just from the mud and muck that he was around or from his birth fluid possibly. He was so small and tiny. He had just been born, just been dragged away from his mom. He was laying there alone in the dirt, without the care of his mother, and he was likely waiting for a truck to take him to a veal facility or a beef facility, and he just looked frightened and alone and sad. these were all farms in Sonoma and Marin counties that is, the hub of this humane small scale farming, and had these labels, and I was shocked. And I realized after doing these investigations that really there was no significant difference between conventional farming and these unregulated labels. And the articles that I was writing back then turned into my first book, The Ultimate Betrayal. And now, 10 years later, there's been so much more information that's come out. And so I wanted to write a second book, but I felt like there's so many people that are advocating now for this. Many more advocates are talking about it. When I wrote my first book, that was the first book that was ever written on the subject of humane washing. And so few people were talking about it. But now, a decade later, many people were talking about it. So I really wanted to feature their voices, other aspects of the topic and the issue. So I started collecting essays and compiled this anthology, The Humane Hoax. And there's activists, there's essays by activists and academics and animal rescuers. There's so many wonderful voices. It was a ton of work. I it was so much work. I almost it might have been easier if I just written the second book myself. Result is that it's a very powerful book. It's representative of a wide swath of activists, of issues. So I'm really grateful to Lantern Publishing and Media for believing in the project and for supporting me through the whole process. And I'm proud of the book.
And everybody here is very proud of publishing that book. I can tell you that for sure. It's one, I mean, we don't pick favorites, but it is one of our favorites.
Here, I love that.
And especially one of the things that I liked, I remember when I started working for Lantern, your book had just came out. And one of the things that I liked about it, and Lantern likes this model a lot, so it has other anthologies, but I think that it's a very modern, contemporary way of you putting knowledge out there, because instead of just like hoarding everything with yourself and saying, I am the one who has all this knowledge. No, you're saying, this is my experience. These are all these other people's experience. And this is how I'm not the only one saying this. There's a lot of other people who are doing similar work and who are saying similar things. I think that brings more credibility, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And my perspective is just one perspective. I mean, I have my
Mm-hmm.
experiences perspective, but it's beautiful to hear other people's perspectives that have come to the same conclusion, but through a different lens and through a completely different life experience. But then we share the same conclusion that we should not harm animals in any way, and we're recognizing that these supposedly new farming methods are really just a respin of of the same old thing, with a different label and a different marketing scheme around it. So it's really cool that so many people from different aspects, from academics to animal rescuers, are coming to the same conclusions.
Yeah. And one of the main topics that you explore in the book, that all of you explore in the book, it's not the main topic, it's humane labeling as a contribution to exploitation of animals. There's a lot to talk about that, I'm sure, and we're already kind of in this topic. So if you can tell us more about this marketing scheme that you've been studying, that you've been doing research on, I think if I'm just going to add another thing that impressed me in that was the whole use of factory farming. You mentioned that on your essay, and how maybe that is perhaps not the best way for activists to approach it anymore. So if you can talk a little bit more about that, please.
Sure. So first, let me just give a quick definition. The humane hoax is, we've heard the term greenwashing. Now we're starting to hear the term humane washing. It's new labeling and marketing around animal products that conveys a false sense that there's some improvement in the industry, either ethically or environmentally, right? The mindset that there's a better way to breed and slaughter animals for their products, for animal products. And I also include in there backyard farming and DIY or do it yourself farming and slaughter. Often people are keeping chickens for eggs or actually slaughtering their own animals. So that is kind of included, I think. It's another aspect of the humane hoax.
Mm-hmm.
So, what I have found through extensive research now, going on decades, both investigative, actually going to the farms, researching the industry, interviewing workers, all of that, I've really come to the conclusion that there are inherent cruelties that are universal to making an animal product profitable. There's just certain practices that are essential to the operation to make a profitable product. Body mutilations, separation of families, slaughter at a young age, not only for flesh products, but for dairy and eggs. So the industry really can't change certain cruel procedures that are just baked into the process. Uh, but what they can manipulate, what they can change to a degree, is the confinement size. And so now, that is what they're focusing on. We're seeing the labels around all that, like cage free and free range. All that has to do with the space that the animals have. But that's not the only cruelty they face. That is not the only horror of their lives. But all the welfare focus kind of gets funneled through that one lens of the size of their confinement, and all the other considerations kind of become invisible, right? So let's hone in on an example. Let's talk about cage free, because cage free is getting so popular. It's been estimated, I think I have the stat in my book, that it's going to be something like 70 or 71% of the market very soon in the next couple of years. So it's really growing. It's huge. So animal activists have done a really wonderful job of exposing what is arguably one of the worst forms of farmed animal abuse, the horrors of egg-laying hens, the hens that are bred for egg laying in the battery cages. The birds are crammed in, stacked on top of one another. It's like living your whole life in a crowded elevator. It's just horrible. So, we've done a good job of exposing that, right? So what the industry has done is, instead of, switching to plant farming, or wanting to get away from egg farming, they're responding to this by changing the story, changing the label, changing consumers' conceptions, so that shoppers now, instead of not buying eggs, they have this seemingly, supposedly humane alternative, right, of cage-free eggs. But the reality for the birds is really minimal, kind of unchanged, really. Most are still living in miserable, overcrowded buildings, these floor systems with thousands of birds. It's basically just like one big cage. And that's actually how birds that are raised for meat are raised. The breeder chickens are raised in floor systems. So these are cruel systems that are used industry-wide already. There's thousands of birds crammed in there. The waste is burning their eyes and throats. They're living in their own waste. They never feel the sun on their wings, and all are going to just a brutal slaughter at a really young age. There's studies that show that there's actually higher mortality rates in cage-free farming, so more birds are dying before they're going to slaughter. I went to a cage-free farm when I was researching for my first book, and it was supposedly one of the best, right? That was one that's sold in the health food stores and only in the health food stores, and they all said it was like the best of the brands. I saw thousands of birds on top of each other with no personal space in dark, dingy, awful, dirty buildings, no sun, no ventilation, birds that looked like they had broken wings that were flopping around, unable to stand, birds missing patches of feathers. It was awful. And that was supposedly, the best of the cage-free local egg options.
And
So,
word, sorry to interrupt, is you mentioned this twice already. Like you said, unregulated labels once, and you're talking about the best of the best now. I'm wondering if there is any criteria behind those certifications, or if they're really just there as a stamp for marketing purposes.
So the labels, there is so little regulation, there's so little oversight. Very few of them have any at all, really. Organic is one of the only of those labels that has actually on-site inspection. Someone comes to the farm to actually see what's going on. So few of them do. Most of them, like cage-free, free range, pasture-raised, all these labels, it's basically just the farmer's word. They fill out a form, they send it into the regulatory body, maybe it's the USDA or the FDA, and they get a stamp of approval. There is very little on-site inspection, and the standards too, even when there is on-site inspection, like with organic or maybe American Certified Humane. I think they may have some on-site inspection that they do with these more certified humane labels. They're so industry friendly that they'll say things like, well, the animal has to have, sufficient food and water. Well, yeah, of course they do. They are fattening them up to have them slaughtered. They have access to food. So they're very industry friendly. Also, species to species, they're very industry friendly. Where, like with organic's a great example of this. They have rules for the cows that they have to have access to the outside, but not for chickens. And that's already industry standard. Chickens are actually very easy to hide. You can just have the chickens inside these buildings for their entire lives. You'll be driving by, never even know that it's a chicken facility. And so for organic certification, they don't have to allow the chickens to have access to the outside. But for cows, there is some, regulation around organic that they have to have access to the outside. Well, they already do. Cows are much larger. With a dairy operation, they move them from barn to barn and building to building. So they already do have access to the outside. So these labels, again, they can be so industry friendly and have so little that has changed, much less improved from conventional to these labels. So it's, I found there were even situations where it can be worse for the animals. One of those is with pork farming and free ranging animals. So there's this romanticized notion that if we just get the animals out of the confinement buildings and out onto pasture, that this is going to, solve all the problems. There's numerous studies actually that show just a variety of problems with free ranging animals, putting them out on pasture, and we have to remember, these animals. These are domesticated animals. They're not wild animals. You can't just put them outside onto pasture and think that everything's going to be fine. Then new issues arise. And there's certainly environmental factors then when you take into account land use, deforestation, when you get into the pasture raised. But there's actually a really great meta-analysis that looks at numerous studies and articles between the year 2000 and 2020, and it focuses on organic and free-range pork operations. And they found that pigs had exposure to extreme temperatures, heat stress, not having adequate shade, and the lighter skinned colored pigs, the pink pigs, they could get painful sunburns and blistering. All the pigs could get extreme cold, being in extreme cold in the winter with frostbite. They found piglets that had hypothermia, pneumonia. They're more vulnerable to predators when they're out on pasture. They have more contact with wildlife and pathogens and viruses like the avian flu. I mean, we're having a severe problem with the avian flu epidemic, and that just started passing to pigs just recently, and that that's exacerbated when these animals are outside the buildings. And this study cited in the first chapter of the book. The first chapter of the book is by Ingrid Taylor, and she had this incredible lived experience of growing up on a small scale pig farm. And that chapter is called A Pig Called Silver, and it has just a wonderful story of her interaction as a child with the pigs on this farm, and then what they experienced and what she witnessed. And also, it goes into great studies and stats like this wonderful meta analysis. So that's a wonderful chapter. Even if you just read the first chapter of the book, only the first chapter of the book, it's a great, great chapter. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for all that. It's definitely, I mean, the book provides a lot of information, a lot of research analysis, as you were discussing right now. And it's definitely a great work. And I mean, I'm biased to say I'm from Lantern, but I'm definitely recommend this to anybody listening to us and who is interested in learning more about it. And especially people, we'll get to that in the end, but I'm going on a journey from vegetarianism to veganism now, and my work with Lantern have been helping me get the information that I need for that now. I think that after reading your book and reading all the essays, especially when I don't remember in which essay it was about the backyard farming, because that's something that I always saw as less harmful. And after reading the book and getting the information from there, it was like, well, actually, that can be even more harmful for the
Yeah.
animals.
Yeah, there's a couple of chapters that touch on that in different aspects of that. Yeah, backyard chicken keeping and slaughter, backyard slaughter. Yeah, my husband Kojin wrote one of the chapters about basically spiritual bypass and backyard slaughter. So very interesting stuff around the psychology of backyard slaughtering, where there's even classes now that they teach to teach people to learn how to slaughter your own animals, and they'll often use very spiritual language around this. And this is, what he says in the chapter can be considered spiritual bypass, where you use spirituality and kind of flower language and kind of feel good language to justify doing very bad things, to justify doing very horrible things. So that's a really interesting chapter.
We know the vegan activist community is out there, and we want to connect with each and every one of you. We are proud supporters of initiatives that fight for a more compassionate world for all animals, humans and non-humans alike. For more content on vegan activism, follow Lantern on social media. We are Lantern Publishing and Media on Facebook, at Lantern PM on Instagram, and at Lantern PM Official on TikTok.
What I wanted to bring as our next topic, which is what is really extreme. And because we have this whole cognitive dissonance, it's a word I learned, an expression I learned recently about how we feel when we don't want to harm animals, but people also eat animals. So how you're not harming them, and it's a whole thing that your brain has to coordinate if you're a person who is against animal violence but also consumes animal flesh. So one of the things that I hear a lot as a vegetarian since I was 13 was don't go too extreme, don't be too much, as if killing is acceptable at some point. So what is really extreme? Like, why do we have to go through that? Why do we have to deal with that judgment, let's say, from the part of most of society when we are simply talking about not killing?
Yeah. Yeah, this is such an interesting topic to me, such an interesting argument that's thrown out often, right, against vegetarians and vegans. Don't be so extreme. It's this interesting, and I think really it's just perspective, right? It's cultural what we consider extreme, and how is confining and causing millions of sentient animals to suffer and then brutally killing them, eating the flesh of their bodies. How is that not extreme? You know, compared
Mhm.
to picking an apple off a tree. It's so interesting what we consider to be extreme. And so in my chapter, I talk about this. I talk about this argument and how it really relies on the faulty premise that being extreme is bad. And why don't we want to be extremely kind, extremely intelligent, extremely innovative? I mean, there's a lot of ways that we can be extreme in good ways. And being vegan is just being extremely compassionate, extremely nonviolent. Why is that a bad thing? But how it relates to the humane hoax is, what the humane hoax offers to people, what the humane labels offer is a way for people to not go to the what they see as extremes of veganism, and they can opt out, opt for a more middle ground or something, for a more acceptable solution of choosing humanely raised meat, dairy, and eggs, or humanely labeled meat, dairy, and eggs. And I think that, I think what's really extreme is eating the flesh of sensitive, sentient animals. And that's really extreme. That's kind of extremely gross, extremely violent, extremely unnecessary. So again, I say that I feel that being extremely kind, extremely compassionate is not a bad thing. We need some extreme kindness in the world right now. So I'm happy to be extremely concerned about the animals, extremely concerned about the state of the planet. And I think there's nothing at all extreme about wanting to eat plants only. Why, why is that extreme? It's just simple.
It was very beautifully said. I mean, I can take inspiration from that, and definitely other people can too, because it's sometimes very exhausting listening to people we love arguing with us, saying that we are very extreme when honestly, what you just said is what I believe in.
Yeah. Great.
I think one of the quotes that kept going through my brain, actually with many of Lantern books, but when I was reading The Human Hoax, and when in some chapters, like the one on feminivorism, that's a very mouthful of a word.
Femivorism.
Feminivorism, thank you very much. And and other moments, like the spirituality chapter that your husband wrote that you're talking about, is a quote by Paulo Freire. He's a Brazilian scholar, was a Brazilian scholar, that says that when we don't receive a emancipatory education, the biggest whim of the oppressed is to become the oppressor. And I think that this is a quote that makes sense when you're talking about a whole society educating people that killing animals and eating animals is okay. Then when you get to a position in which you can question that, when you grow older, because usually that's something that you learn when you were a child, when you grow older and you have a position where you can question yourself, then your main dream is like to, no, let's just keep doing what I couldn't do, the type of oppression that I couldn't do. Maybe I'm stretching this a little too much, but it's just something that constantly is on my mind when we talk about groups of people that have everything in their hands to change that and to question that reality, but they just prefer to keep doing it.
So yeah, I think it's really important to recognize that this is an anti-oppression movement. This is just another form of oppression, domination over sentient beings. And I'm grateful that we are expanding our circle of compassion to include non-human animals in that kind of systems of oppression, that the systems of oppression that we see against so many human cultures and populations. This is just an extension of that. And there are chapters that address this in the book. Christopher Soul Eubanks' chapter addresses this. where we're really trying to not separate our movement and the animals from what's happening worldwide on a global scale of uplifting everyone and trying to connect these issues. There's domination and oppression of many cultures and beings on this planet, and the animals are just part of that.
Lantern Publishing and Media is devoted to sharing messages of compassion. Our books inspire a better world by telling the stories of animal rights activists, climate activists, and their fights for a world where everyone can live in harmony, no matter their species. Lantern is a 501c non-for-profit organization. Your donation helps us keep our work going. If you can, go to lanternpm.org/donate to help us with any amount. Once again, the website is lanternpm.org/donate. Your generous gift enables you to support our collective mission to inform, inspire, and educate. Thank you very much.
Since the book came out, since I saw that you did a whole series on your own podcast about it, you talked to people, you got the reviews, you got the feedbacks. So I was wondering, what kind of reception did the book have? Further thoughts, praise, criticism, what changed, what didn't in this year since the book is out?
Well, I've gotten a lot of support. It's been wonderful. People feeling like this issue isn't really addressed enough in animal advocacy, and they're really grateful that I've addressed it. I've had people tell me that there's even someone that is writing a book, and they took inspiration from this book and learned so much from this book, and it helped them to write and formulate their book. It's really amazing how it has affected people. And I've also had people confess to me that they were duped by the Humane Hoax, and they were buying these products, and that my book opened their eyes to the truth. So it's been very powerful in that way. Now, I have gotten some criticism, and a bit of negative feedback, and I'd love to address that if I could.
Of course.
Yeah, because, I think that a lot of people are uninformed. They have the same question that I hear, and it goes something like this. People will say, well, why are you focusing on just a small number of animals on small farms? You should focus on the bigger picture, on bigger farms and industrial animal farming, right? A couple things about that. First of all, people need to realize that this issue is not just about small farms and not just about a small number of animals. And I do address this in the book. Big industrial companies, they use humane washing as well. They use this marketing and labeling as well. And I talk about this, I detail this in the intro of the book and in my chapter. Companies with tens of thousands of animals, sometimes on one facility, will use labels like certified humane, like family farms. So in the book, I actually talk about an undercover investigation of Fairlife Dairy. And Fairlife Dairy is a huge dairy operation. They have numerous farms with thousands and thousands of cows. And as the name implies, it's a newer company. They kind of came out in response to some of the critique in the dairy industry, and they claim on their websites that they give a better life for the animals, a fair life. And in this investigation, this was in 2019, this investigation, they found, those inherent cruelties that I talked about in the beginning, all those inherent cruelties on these farms. And also, the calves were being separated from their mothers at birth, which is industry standard, no matter the label. But the calves were also being dragged around and thrown and kicked and punched. I mean, it was brutal and awful video footage that was very hard to watch. And, here's a company that claims to have even higher standards than usual for the animals. And they are not a small operation. This is a huge, large scale operation. Butterball Turkey, one of the largest turkey meat producers in the US, uses the American Certified Humane label. And I go into details about how in the book, about how that label means very little, and those animals still suffer under that label. So that's just one part. That's the kind of the first part of the critique. it's not small farms. It's not only small farms that use these labels. But the other part of this is that there is a systematic issue going on, a systematic problem. It's sometimes been called the psychological refuge effect, where people incorrectly assume that they're eating humanely treated animals because of these labels, and it helps them to justify their animal product consumption on a larger scale, just all around. So, a consumer may hear, they see cage-free eggs, they hear about the cruelty in egg operations, and so they start buying cage-free eggs. So now, instead of avoiding eggs altogether, they are buying cage-free, they're still identifying as an egg eater, and they feel that they're helping. But when they go out to a restaurant, they're going to order the omelet that was made with conventional eggs, or they go to a cafe and they get a cookie that was baked with just, regular eggs. And this is exactly what the industry wants. They want people to continue to identify as egg eaters, as meat eaters, having these few products with the humane label. It gives a false sense that there's some industry-wide improvement because of the availability of those humane labels, but that's not the reality. And so people continue to eat the eggs. They think they think that things are improving on the farm, but the reality is that actually things are getting worse for the animals, not better. So now, consumers are being told that there's a kind and compassionate way to commodify animals, and not be they don't have to be seen as going to the extremes of going vegan. We've given them this option to choose humanely labeled products, so the industry has given them this option. So again, we're not talking about just a few number of animals on small farms. We're talking about a systematic issue that can lull consumers into possibly even eating more animal products, thinking they're doing the right thing, thinking they're helping the industry that is reforming, when it's all a marketing scheme. It's all a lie.
When I first became vegetarian at 13, I was already 13, barely, but yes. I remember I had to get a lot more creative, especially living in the south of Brazil. We are very close to Argentina, Uruguay, so it's a very like cow eating culture there. And I remember going to restaurants. I had the support of my mom and some people in my family. And even so, with that support was much easier to transition. But going to restaurants and all, I had to get creative because even their salad had bacon on it, and it was very,
Yeah.
very hard. So, and nowadays, back home here, well, I live in New York City, so it's a big city. Obviously, it's going to have options.
New York has some of the best options.
Yes, yes. And I've been lucky to find them every time. And I feel like even in Brazil, in the city where I came from, it was so much easier. We have a burger restaurant in the city center that became famous for its vegan burger, that it was way better than the regular, let's say, burger that people started to like. Even people who ate animals, they were there and they were like, no, I just want the vegan burger because it tastes better. So I was so happy when that day came. It was just awesome. But yeah, the scenery is getting better. And Hope, I wanted to ask you like one question for myself, because I always try to squeeze in the podcast a little question for myself, because I'm going vegan now, and I'm doing it the same way that I did to become a vegetarian. I'm going slowly and getting my body used to it, and having more vegan days than vegetarian days, to a point that it's going to be 100%. So it's extremely inconvenient. I'm not going to lie. It is something that it's inconvenient when I'm with friends, when I want to make a choice, when I want to have ice cream and I have to remind myself that I have to prioritize vegan ice cream. And I am making that choice consciously, and I'm being very open about the inconvenience, because I feel like society makes it inconvenient for us. And I feel like inconvenience is not enough for me to justify killing, to justify mistreatment of animals anymore. So if for people like me who are going through that journey, for people like me who are, okay, inconvenience is not an argument for me anymore, Do you have any inspiration, advice, encouragement to keep us on the right track?
Sure. People have a lot of arguments for eating meat, for not being vegan, that it's more natural or that they didn't feel good when they tried vegan. There's lots of things that people say. But I believe that there are two barriers that really most people run into or encounter, and this is backed up by studies. And these two things are inconvenience, like you mentioned, just the access to the food, and also not enough social support. I think that's another really serious issue, that we should address. Talking about the suffering of animals, it's really a serious issue, right? And people don't want to hurt animals, but then it's socially and societally accepted to eat animals and animal products. So I think that people feel that it's trivial, that these are kind of trivial concerns, inconvenience, or not social support. So they don't want to really admit that that's what's going on, right? So they'll use these other excuses that seem more important or more philosophical or more substantial. But I think these are legitimate concerns, that we should address. And my advice for the first one, the inconvenience issue, is that, just being aware that any lifestyle change, any big change, especially if it's good for you or for the planet or for your health, it's going to be difficult at first. It's going to be difficult. And we often say, oh, being vegan's so easy. But that's someone probably that's been vegan a long time is saying that. And perhaps they don't remember, when they first started going vegan, that it can be difficult. So you're going to need to change habits, and that can be hard, right? So my advice, plan ahead. I think that's very important. Meal planning, finding recipes, carving out a bit more time for shopping and cooking and planning, at least in the beginning until you get used to it, knowing that it will get more routine. There's a million recipes online. And go with things you're familiar with. Like if you always made lasagna and you loved making lasagna on the weekend, then Google vegan lasagna recipes, and there'll be 2 dozen, and make it lasagna that time. Finding restaurants that you can suggest to your group of friends or family, so you have something vegan to eat, they have something that they like to eat. So you've got, that suggested restaurant ready to go and you're with friends that are not vegan. Keeping snacks on hand in your car or at work in case there isn't a vegan option in some circumstance, right? And this is really important, not beating yourself up if you slip. If you slip up, don't throw up your hands and give up. Try again and try again. It sometimes takes people numerous times to quit smoking, to get into a workout routine. It's the same with going vegan. So just, don't beat yourself up, move on the next day. It's a new day the next day and try again. So the second issue, the not enough social support, I think this is a really important one too. I think you have to have fellow vegans, at least one vegan friend, that maybe you go to lunch with on occasion. I think it's so important to not feel isolated or alone. You start really looking at the world differently when you go vegan. You suddenly see animal suffering, animal cruelty everywhere in advertisements on TV. You really can start seeing the world differently than your friends and family, and it can be very lonely. So I really feel it's important to be able to have a vegan buddy that you can rant with, that you can cry with. You got to find your vegan tribe. You got to have that vegan support. There's probably a local vegan group in your area that does potlucks or other social events. If not, you can find vegans online. There's Facebook vegan groups, and other platforms have vegan groups. So find your vegan people. I think that is really critical. And something just to add for new vegans. New vegans, often the first people we want to talk to about it are friends and family, right? Our family. We go to our family, and of course, we want to tell them about all the horrible things that we've learned. And of course, they're going to go vegan, right? I mean, how would they not after learning all this? Well, Unfortunately, more often than not, we find out that family and friends don't want to hear about it. They don't want to hear about it from you. And that can be really frustrating and really isolating. So, know that could happen, that it might not be that everyone in your orbit wants to hear about it or wants to go vegan. And so approach it, kind of cautiously. I mean, you can certainly talk about it and you should. I don't mean to say don't talk about it, but just be aware that people may not want to hear about it from you at that time. But there are a lot of people out there that do want to hear about it. There's people that you can find online or friends that do want to talk about it. That those early adopters, those change makers that are going to be open to talking about it. So find those people. You don't have to talk to everyone in the beginning if that's not comfortable for you. So I hope that helps. I think that that's something that we kind of get caught in, like, oh, I have to get everybody to go vegan. And we really don't. Actually, interestingly, in the social sciences, when social movements are making big changes, we really only need a small percentage of the population to make that change, kind of the critical mass of early adopters to have it go mainstream. And it's estimated that could be somewhere between 7 to 20% of the population that makes these changes, and then it can just bleed into or seep into the larger population and go mainstream. So we don't need everyone. We don't need all of your family to go vegan. Focus on people that do want to hear it and are interested, and those are the people we need to be connecting with.
Hope, thank you very much. I was sitting down here and making a list with everything you were saying. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for having such a rich exchange here at the podcast today. Before I let you go, I want to know if you have any message you want to give our listeners, any projects, anything that you're working on that you want us to add to perhaps the podcast description. The floor is all yours. Please go ahead.
Sure. Well, I'll just say that, my organization, Compassionate Living, we'd love you to learn about it, get involved, go to our website, sign up for our e-news. And if you are a spiritual vegan, and into the Dharma traditions like Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, I'm going to be having a monthly online gathering starting in 2025 that is called the Ahimsa Living Circle. And that's going to be every second Saturday of the month. And that is through Compassionate Living. And you can sign up for our e-newsletter to get announcements about that if you're interested in that. So that's something new that we have coming up. And we have lots of other projects. Of course, I have my Humane Hoax project. And also the Hope for the Animals podcast. So I have my own podcast you could check out. And I'll wrap up though just by saying, I like to say this at the end of when I'm talking about the Humane Hoax, is that even though this is a very sad subject and intense and frustrating to know that that this is all a marketing scheme and lie, I do feel that it is a positive progression. It's interesting because the industry is basically they're admitting that animals suffer in animal farming, right? But through these labels. So, and why do people seek out these labels? It's because they care and they care about animals and they don't want them to suffer. So, these products wouldn't sell if people weren't buying them and they didn't care. So that is hopeful. All of that is very hopeful. And I think this is just a stage that we have to go through. The logical progression, the logical conclusion of treating animals humanely is that we do not commodify and kill them. I really believe we'll get there, but we can't be complacent. We can't think that people are going to get there on their own because the marketing and labels are lying to them. So we have to be the voice of truth. We have to continue educating and telling the animal stories, showing that anytime animals are commodified, there is abuse, there's suffering, no matter the label. So I think it's only a matter of time. Caring consumers are going to demand, I believe, the only truly humane option, which is vegan. And I believe that, care and love and compassion of everyday people will end animal farming. We just have to reach them. And I hope that my book is part of that.
Amazing. And if people want to buy your book, they can go to lanternpm.org. We have a little tab here that says books. Just look for the Humane Hoax. We're going to have the links for pretty much anywhere you buy books. You can pick your favorite, go there, or buy the ebook on our website too. It's also available. So if you're listening to this podcast and you got interested, you want to learn more about the Humane Hoax, please go ahead. Also follow us on social media, ask us more about the book over there. Follow Hope and her podcast as well. We're going to put all the links here in the description. Hope, thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we'll talk again soon, okay?
Sounds good. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.